I want to touch briefly on some of the new and proposed policy developments in super from both the government and an ASIC perspective, before focusing on some of our surveillance activities from the previous financial year and in the year ahead, which will probably be of most interest to you. So there are a number of elements of the stronger super reform that are almost here. And I do feel a certain sense of deja vu in standing here, because I think 2 years ago, I said portfolio holdings is nearly upon us, and it seems to be always nearly there. I know this is really an area for government consideration at the moment, but I thought there were a number of points about particularly choice dashboards that were worth raising in this context. You may have noticed in the consultation process that there are a number of additional elements that were added to the dashboards, and you might have wondered where they came from. In particular, the government consulted in relation to an asset allocation pie chart, a super estimator, and the inclusion of some comparison information on the product dashboards. So I thought I'd talk a little in more detail about those. So in 2014, ASIC undertook some further consumer testing in relation to the choice dashboard with our researchers Latitude Insights. In this testing, we found that people really liked the idea of an asset allocation pie chart to help them make decisions about their super. And they also liked the idea of comparative information. So for example, if they could see the returns for their fund, it helped them to know what the industry average for, say, returns or fees would be as well, in order to make a proper assessment of the product they were in. For the people who reported lower levels of financial literacy, tended to really like the idea of the new super estimator. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the super estimator is basically a cut-back version of the Money Smart calculators that populates with some of the information from a trustee's dashboard, particularly the return target and the fees. What it does is it enables some consumers who really engage with information in this way, it gives them an opportunity to play with the information a little and see what the retirement predictions might be for them. We thought the inclusion of this information in the dashboard helped expand its usefulness to the maximum number of people. Now, I must say there's been a lot of feedback given to government about the dashboards following the consultation process. So in light of this, the government may make decisions about whether some of those elements go ahead or whether they're dropped from consideration. This is probably a nice way of saying I don't exactly know where this is going to land just yet. I wish I did. On portfolio holdings disclosure, just a quick point to make. The ASIC, of course, remains firm supporters of the portfolio holdings disclosure regime, but again, this is really a matter for government at the moment in terms of the look and detail of it, particularly around things like materiality thresholds. We do think it's highly likely that that 1 July start date is likely to change, but whatever the start date is, ASIC will be issuing guidance for you ahead of the regime starting. So I've spoken a little bit about some of the law reform from government. There are some areas of policy where ASIC has had a bit of an interest in. Just to pick up on some of the things Nick said, obviously government sets legislation. Regulators do have a small role to play in sometimes making a few adjustments to those regimes where we see problems in practice. So you'd be familiar that late last year, ASIC released a revised Regulatory Guide 97 in relation to fees and costs and a modified class order. Part of the reasons for the modifications to the class order had to do with the complexity of the initial interposed vehicle definition in our original class order, which is probably a subject that you're well familiar with. So we've made some changes. In terms of transition, those dates also changed, and the amendments to the class order essentially extended the transition period for PDSs until 1 February 2017. I do want to emphasise that that's a hard start date. And by that I mean, as of 1 February next year, your PDS must comply with the new fee requirements. And I'm really only emphasising that because we've had a number of conversations with trustees where there seems to have been some confusion around that point. We'll obviously continue our engagement with industry during the transition period for the new guidance and the amended regulatory requirements to encourage the development of standards and to assist industry in the implementation of these new measures. If you do have issues with the new requirements and you have questions, we do encourage you to come forward now, well ahead of that 1 February start date. In the fees and costs media release that we put out last year, we also flagged that we're going to change, and we did change, the start date for the consistency requirements in 29QC. For those of you who may have forgotten about these. These are the requirements that essentially align APRA's reporting requirements with the disclosure requirements. So, for example, if you report a net return, you'd need to report it the way it's calculated for APRA. At the moment, we're not doing any work on 29QC until such time as we know exactly what the dashboard regime looks like, because we think probably we will limit the scope of 29QC to elements of the dashboard. So it's very much a case of watch this space. So I'll talk now, moving away from policy, into a bit more detail about some of our surveillance work. So last year we undertook quite a bit of surveillance work in relation to 29QB, which is the new Executive Officer Remuneration and Systemic Transparency requirements. We found that generally trustees seem to have understood what was required of 29QB. However, there were pockets of non-compliance, and in fact in some instances we couldn't find websites at all for some trustees, and obviously we're making further inquiries with those trustees to try to get them on board. We released our findings in a media release in September last year, along with some examples of best practice disclosure. One of the biggest challenges we found as a regulator was simply finding the information in the first instance. As you can imagine, your PDS is unlikely to be sitting on the same part of your website as your proxy voting policies. So one of the things we suggested in our media release was, if it's possible, to put all the links to the information on your website on one web page. So you can continue to have your PDS and your proxy voting policies separate, but if there could be one page that at least included all the links to that information, it would make it significantly easier for us to check whether you're complying. Also, as part of our ongoing regulatory activities, we've carried out a review program on a number of superannuation trustees. In these reviews, we serve notices, conduct on-site visits. We do these reviews every year. This is very much our bread and butter work. One of the things that came out of the reviews last year was that we saw a number of concerns relating to strategies used by some trustees to gain and retain members. And that's inevitable, particularly where you're in a competitive superannuation environment. One of the concerns related to the presentation of rollover forms attached to product disclosure statements, and sometimes those rollover forms were presented in such a way that a new member joining might have felt that they had to roll over their existing super into their new fund in order to join, and we were a bit concerned about that. We're also a bit concerned in some instances about the promotion of self-managed investment options, where the disclosure around those options sometimes gave the impression that they provided the members with the same level of choice and control as a self-managed super fund, when obviously they don't. In these instances, we obtained corrective disclosure and discussed our concerns with the trustees, who were very cooperative. However, I did want to mention it here today because I think it's worth flagging ASIC's expectations that when you're developing a strategy for gaining and retaining members, it's worth bearing in mind that you can't cross into that misleading and deceptive territory in your statements. If you do want any further information about that particular review project, we released a media release in September last year, which was Media Release 251, and it has quite a bit more detail than some of the things I've just mentioned here. Now, oops, I'll go back, sorry. In 2005, and we undertook some review work in relation to Section 68A, which is the employer inducement provision in the SIS Act. You're probably well aware that there has been quite a bit of interest in the topic of employer inducements. So we looked at both industry and retail funds to see what types of benefits are offered to employers. And it's fair to say there are benefits offered to employers, although generally not in breach of Section 68A. So of the trustees we looked at, we did not find any clear breaches of the SIS Act. But one of the things we did in response to that review work, we took a slightly different and unusual approach. We decided to take the step of including information for employers on our MoneySmart website and include them amongst the group of consumers who might be interested in information about super. So we gave them information about selecting a default super fund, information about fees, insurance, performance, all the things that you might expect. We also included information on the MoneySmart website to warn employers that perhaps choosing a super fund on the basis of inducements alone is not a good idea. And we also gave them our contact details that if they found inducements that were illegal, they could report that to us. We're yet to hear, I think, from anybody, but it's early days. We did release a media release, and it's earlier this year, and it's Media Release 038, if that's of any interest. Okay, I realise that I am running out of time, so I might skip through regulatory approach to talk about the year ahead. Just in terms of our work coming up, and this is really so that you know what you might be, or how you might be hearing from ASIC, we have a number of major projects that are going to be running in 2016. So some of the things that we're going to be looking at the effectiveness of disclosure. And this is ranging from stronger super disclosures like product dashboards, right through to some of those disclosures that ASIC doesn't see very often. Things like ADA notices, significant event notices, or even information given directly to employers. You're probably starting to get an employer theme going on here. We're also interested in issues around consumer passivity in default super. And really looking at things through a behavioural economics lens, we're looking at where consumers are most vulnerable in the superannuation space and what we could do to assist them in those particular circumstances. I think transfers without consent and probably some aspects of insurance are going to feature heavily in this project. Also, our review work where we visit a small number of trustees each year will continue. In fact, we have 3 trustees in a project at the moment and those notices have already gone out. In terms of themes, you can expect that topics such as insurance, particularly following APRA's recent thematic review and obviously some of the incidents with CommonSure, will feature in our reviews of both trustee conduct and reviews of disclosure. One of the things that we'll be interested in as well, and this is right across the financial services spectrum, is this issue of culture. Where we refer to culture, we mean a set of shared values or assumptions that can reflect the underlying mindset of an organisation. It can shape and influence people's attitudes and behaviours, for example, towards their customers and in relation to compliance. From a regulator's perspective, ASIC is concerned about culture because it's a key driver of conduct in the financial services industry. So you can expect to see in notices and surveillance questions from ASIC, questions that are designed to get to the entity's culture. We're also concerned too with conflicts, and our existing project on vertical integration has looked at some of these issues in 2015. A public report on that project shouldn't be very far away now. We'll also continue to review promotional material, and you will have seen in 2015 that ASIC has been quite active in imposing infringement notices on trustees. We do want to emphasise that communications to employers are still promotional material, and that's an area, again, that we might look at in the future. We also want to remind trustees that a number of the stronger super reforms are now no longer subject to our facilitative compliance message, and my super product dashboards are a very good example of this. So please do make sure that the information you include in your product dashboards has been calculated the way that APRA requires you to calculate it for their reporting purposes. In fact, I think I'd say it's highly likely that trustees who have interesting looking product dashboard data are likely to appear in our effective disclosure project this year. Now, I realise I'm probably over time, and that's a very quick rundown of some of the issues that ASIC is looking at the moment. We do also maintain our commitment to industry engagement and liaison, and very much welcome the opportunity to present here today, and happy to take questions afterwards. Thank you.
In 10 minutes, I won't cover policy. What I want to cover is what we're doing from a supervision viewpoint and what you can expect to see from APRA at your fund level over the next year or so. In terms of the focus of our supervision for the next year, we have probably 3 key elements. One is on the ongoing implementation of the prudential framework. We all know that the framework is fairly new and that trustees and funds are putting those frameworks into place. We've been looking at that over the last couple of years and we will continue to do so. Focusing on the strategies that you have in place for your institutions, and one that I stress to my staff is keeping an eye on business as usual activity. It's very easy to get caught up in the issues of the day or to get caught up in all the policy agenda that's going on, but in doing that we can often lose sight of the key elements of running a fund from an APRA viewpoint. So investments, operational risk governance remain imperative regardless of what's happening in the policy framework, so we continue to do work around that. In terms of what you'll see us doing and how we're going about it, one of the principal tools we've started using over the last 2 years, which I think is a good thing, are thematic reviews. And most of you will be familiar with the thematic reviews that APRA has been doing. These are ones where we do cross-industry and even throughout the industry and even cross-industry reviews of a particular risk, where we select a sample of funds or a sample of institutions and delve in depth on that particular risk with a view to find better practice for industry, weaker practice, which we can then communicate to the broader industry in the form of a letter or an insight article and communicate to our own staff for elements they should be looking at when they go in the field. So to date, we've done a conflicts of interest review. If you haven't seen it, there was a letter issued in March of 2015 that highlighted the need for frameworks around identifying conflict, sound governance structures, policies and procedures, and related party dealings. That letter poses a series of questions to trustees, and if you're on a trustee board, I would expect that it's come to you and that you've considered the questions within there, because you can be sure that when my supervisors come out, they're going to ask you, how do you think you sit against all of those questions? How have you dealt with those sorts of questions? We also, falling out of that, and if you read the Inside article which came out at the end of 2015 on the APRA site, we did highlight related parties as something that we wanted to have a bit more of a look at. So in 2016, what we're intending to do is undertake a thematic review of related party arrangements by selecting a sample of funds across all segments of the industry. The review's there to let us look a bit more deeper into what industry practice is around related party dealings, again with the idea that we will release a letter, an article on what we see as better practice and what we see as weaker practice. So if you are selected for that, I encourage you to participate wholly in that one. We've done a thematic review on insurance and superannuation, and it highlighted the importance around governance, insurance management frameworks, insurance benefit design, selection and due diligence, monitoring, underwriting, claims management, etc. Again, there's a very good article on that on the website in the Inside article, and again, I'd encourage you to read it because it highlights better practice and weaker practice, and that's what our supervisors will be looking to go through with you as they come out on review. Going forward, we've selected a number of topics for this coming year. One we're doing which is across industry, because this risk I think is across every industry, and it's one that when I'm talking with trustees and I go to a large number of board meetings throughout the year, when I ask them what keeps them awake at night, invariably 2 out of 3 times the answer is cyber risk. I'm scared of walking in tomorrow and the money's gone. So we're going to do a cross-industry review on cyber security. We'll be selecting 40 entities plus key service providers across all industry types that APRA supervises. The survey will cover governance, cyber incidents, risk management and assurance, and cyber security capabilities. Again, the idea is to get a feel for what's being done in industry, what's being done well, and what could be improved upon as a first step in taking a big step into cyber. We also continue to have a focus on investment governance. We've done a liquidity stress testing thematic, which is coming towards its end, and you can expect in the first half of 2016 to see a report coming out on that one. So I would encourage you to keep an eye out for that. Governance, culture and remuneration is another cross-industry project that we're looking at. I mean, anyone who's read speeches from anyone anywhere in the world post-GFC knows that the importance of the linkage of these 3 things and what happens when it runs awry. So what we've done is set up a specific team with responsibility for governance, culture and remuneration across APRA, and that team is looking to develop a framework for our supervisors to apply in our supervision going forward. The first step in that is for them to get out and meet with boards to understand what you do, how you do it, what you do well, what can be done better, so that we can get that framework out and we can communicate to industry what we're seeing as better practice. And finally, the final thematic we're looking at for particularly superannuation is in board operation. We're proposing to undertake a more in-depth thematic review to obtain further insight into superannuation industry practices in relation to nomination, appointment and removal of directors, board size, renewal and tenure, and also board performance assessment. Again, this is to help us step up our commentary on what we see as work that needs to be done, work that's being done well, work that's not being done as well as it could be done. So we will scope that shortly, and you can expect to see that coming through. So those are the principal cross-industry thematics that we will do, and they will inform our supervision process. I sort of sat back then and thought about what else can I talk to you about in 3 minutes and 30 seconds. So other issues that are exercising my mind that I particularly talk to boards about when I'm out and find some commonality in discussion, I'll just highlight them and we can perhaps tease them out in the questions. So investments is particularly strong in my mind at the moment. You think about superannuation, what do? You take money from members, you invest it for a very long time with the idea of giving them an adequate retirement as they come up. We are currently sitting in what I think is a fairly unprecedented low interest rate environment. And from all the commentary I read, and I don't pretend to know the answer, but all the commentary I read indicates it's here for quite a while. That presents challenge to the superannuation industry in what returns you can deliver. So I have great interest when I'm talking to boards in, are boards staying the course with their investment portfolio structured as it was, or are they moving to change the risk because they can't get from bills and bonds and fixed interest what they used to get? So each time we come out, you can expect that sort of conversation to take place. The scale, or as we prefer to call it more, the member outcome test is one that's front of mind. I'd say on that, it's still early days in terms of making that assessment, but the key thing that we're looking to see at present is that trustees are actually undertaking a robust assessment each year. Not treating it just as a compliance thing, but a robust assessment of, are we delivering what we said we would do for the members? And that's not just about fees or costs. We're looking for a consideration of net returns, performance relating to the investment objective of the fund, the benefits and the services provided. So we will look to actively engage with you in discussions on that. We are very interested in talking on business plan and strategy and sustainability going forward. I had a look at some stats this week on just up for the year to December 2015. Based on that, about half of our funds have more money going out the door than they have coming in the door each year. That presents a real challenge to your model and to your business going forward. So what we're trying to understand is, what is the business plan for each of the RSEs we're doing? And the question I ask, and it's always a favourite of mine, which is the why us question. If anyone has, I've got my dollar of superannuation, and then let's pretend it's not a default dollar, it's a choice dollar, and I could put it anywhere. So what I ask each of the RSEs that I speak to is, why would I put it to you? What is it that your fund delivers that should make me want to give you my dollar? The better funds, the better trustees that I talk to can articulate that off the top of their head. The trustees that look at me with a bit of a blank look are the ones that clearly have some work to do around, well, what is our business plan? What is our future? Why are we here? So you can expect that we'll be having ongoing discussions with that. Post-retirement products is a very interesting one. The FSI recommendations around comprehensive income products for retirement. Again, most trustee boards that I talk to are looking at what are they going to do in that space. And it's relevant. If you look at the statistics, at present lump sums continue to exceed pensions in the APRA regulated world. So clearly, if you want to be retaining members and retaining fund, you need to be developing product that encourages them to stay with you and to take out a pension type product. So we will be having discussions with people over, well, what's your intentions? What are you seeking to develop in that area? Administrators is a particular area of interest. We all know there's been a significant consolidation in the administrator network. So the question that we're looking at is, A, how are those transitions taking place, and what does that mean longer term in terms of an alternative? If you were to decide that your existing administrator isn't the one, where do we go now? So we will be just having discussions and expecting that trustees will have actually considered that point going forward. One that we have as an APRA dedicated objective is crisis preparedness. Crisis preparedness for us from what would APRA do if an institution is failing, and equally importantly, what would you intend to do if it was you? So everybody says, well, it's not going to be me, we're a good organisation, we won't fail, and that's right for just about everyone. But it's not necessarily 100% right. We would rather see you considering well in advance of an event how you would go about handling something like that. So we will have discussions around that. The final two that I'll call out is DB fund solvency. We will continue to look at, given the way markets have been oscillating. I'm particularly interested in that in the assumptions that the actuaries are coming up with. Have they changed given the new sort of conditions that we're in? Or are we still living on old assumptions? And if we are, what's the reason behind that? Is that a longer term view, a view that things will change again, or what is it? But I think it's a conversation worth having. And finally, one thing that I am seeing from a number of funds is starting to re-insource elements that they'd previously outsourced. Very keen to understand the reason for coming back insourcing, and I don't say it's the wrong answer or the right answer, but what's the reason for coming back in? How are you satisfied you've got the right skill set to do what you want to do? And how do you benchmark the in-source part versus how you would benchmark an outsource? Fairly simple. With an outsourced provider, you set benchmarks, and if they don't meet it, you can look for another one. If you spend the money setting up the in-source provider and it's not hitting your benchmarks, what are you going to do? And I could go on for another hour and a half, but they are some of the things exercising my mind, and I'm happy to discuss those when I sit down, and I look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Just before we go to questions, I'd just remind all the delegates to rate the session and provide any feedback via the CMSF app. I'll take some of the listed questions that we've had sent through, and then we'll go to audience questions in 5 minutes or so, live audience questions. Just if I could start, Stephen, the issue of insurance, which is a very recent and controversial topic for pretty obvious reasons concerning ComInsure. Do you think trustees, what is a trustee's duty and obligation in the area of oversighting insurance, particularly payout? And do you think trustees have been paying that area adequate attention in recent times?
Okay. There is on our website, I'd encourage you, in the Inside article, there's a very good article on a review we did of insurance. We made some comments that I think are relevant. Particularly of relevance is the claims philosophy. What we've tried to encourage is for funds themselves to form their claims philosophy and then seek to see that the insurer's claims philosophy is consistent with that. We also highlighted the need for ongoing monitoring and assessment of insurance. I think we highlighted that tended to be a lot of effort goes in at the point of renewal, but given the importance of insurance within the funds, we would expect that reporting and attention at the higher levels is given along the course of the insurance contract, not just at those key points. So,
do you think this issue slipped down the radar for trustees? Certainly some of what I pick up here, a lot of trustees are looking at their insurance contracts in a great deal more detail, and particularly payouts and claim beneficiaries.
I suspect it was a little bit down, although I would say what we found through our review was that it's back on the radar and it's getting stronger, but we'd certainly highlighted there was more to do.
Yeah. Okay, another issue, you touched, but very briefly, on the scale test. The definition of scale test, one of the questions we've had come through is, I think you mentioned benefits and services in addition to fees and returns, etc. Is that part of the scale test?
I'm reading that question in front of me. No, it's not written in the legislation, but I guess what we're trying to encourage is to lift the view that was presented early, and it's been in press and whatever, that it was all about size or it was all about fee. What we're trying to say is it's more about have you delivered the member outcome that the member was expecting you to deliver.
But return and fees pretty fundamental.
Yeah, it's part. I mean, it's all wraps up as part of it. But we're saying don't concentrate purely on one element, but it's a bigger test for people. Because I had people saying to me, well, clearly if a fund is X size, they have to leave. But you can be a smaller boutique provided that you are delivering the member outcome that the people are expecting.
Well, some smaller funds may have higher average balances for historical reasons, etc.
So I'm not trying to rewrite the definition. Please don't think that. I'm just trying to lift the eyes on what that assessment is.
Okay, but pretty obviously, I mean, I wasn't aware. You said half the funds have more going out than in.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware it was quite that number. We've got 250 funds now. APRA more than
RSC, yeah, okay.
Yeah. But, 250, it hasn't moved at all in the last 18 months, looking at the stats. We've now got 103 MySuper, or funds with MySuper. It seems to me if you haven't got a MySuper licence, you're not going to have much chance of surviving longer term. I mean, you know, you look at the scale test and having to provide my super, which is pretty fundamental. There are a lot of funds that should be thinking long and hard about their future, and also given your statistic about more money going out than coming in.
And I think that's why I raised the point about when we talked about your business plan and your sustainability, it's trustees should be looking at the long term with the, you know, purely with the member interest in mind. What is our future?
Yeah.
I won't try and guess how many people will say how many funds should there be. We don't have any number around that. It's more about, is this a sustainable fund?
Yeah, no, I understand that, but there's some pretty compelling material you've given us, and looking at the stats that would seem to indicate there's a sizable number of funds that have got a lot of work to do in the next year or two if they're going to be around.
Yeah, I mean that's part of that's why the numbers. That's why the statistics are collected, and that's why we go and talk to people.
Yeah. So when do you expect to be activating an engagement with funds that come to your attention? I mean, is this work starting now?
Yeah, I mean it's ongoing work. APRA supervises on risk, so each fund is assessed by the supervisor for the risks that are applicable to that fund. And we go out on a regular review basis, prioritising those that we see at the higher end of the scale.
Yeah. Question to both of you, which intrigued me. Super funds are starting to move into aged care advice space. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think as we see the government increasingly looking at retirement income products and SIPPers and things like this, we are starting to hear that, and I think it's a valid point, that you can't consider superannuation in accumulation phase or even retirement incomes in its isolation without considering whether age pension, aged care facilities, all of these costs have to be factored in for appropriate advice. So I don't doubt there will be work in our financial advisors team in terms of looking at advice and the types of advice given to people who are finding themselves in a retirement situation like this. But in some ways, I think the legislative framework is already in place for that. So hopefully we can address it and we're on top of it. But we are aware that people are increasingly factoring in aged care facilities and things like that into advice-related activity.
If we just stay with you, Alex, for a moment. Going back to the first point of your speech on dashboards, one of the questions from the audience was that their observations from their fund was that they had virtually no one looking at dashboards, no members looking at dashboards, and that regulators and other funds were the main observers. I mean, do you think that's reasonable at this point in time, or is it early days? Or
that's a really interesting comment, because I was having a conversation with somebody just last week who said very similar things, and they said, in fact, a lot of the traffic's internal. It's their own compliance people just going back in to make sure things are up on the website. Yeah. So I do think that there are some issues there that need addressing, and the government, when it consulted on the choice dashboards, did think about whether perhaps there need to be some proximity rules, how close to the homepage the product dashboard appears, because I think it is true to say right now the product dashboard is not necessarily being used as that kind of first point of contact for consumers, and there's probably more work to do in that regard. I'm not throwing all of that onto industry either, I should say, or onto government in terms of changing regulations. There's probably more we can do with MoneySmart to promote some of these things. And you probably remember, but way back in 2013, we did talk about perhaps putting product dashboard data up on the MoneySmart website so that people could compare and contrast different MySuper offerings. And that again might help to drive traffic if that ever goes ahead, but that would also help to drive some traffic towards the product dashboards. But I would agree with the comment right now that it probably isn't the primary sort of first disclosure point that perhaps we'd hoped for.
Okay, I mean, it is early days.
It is.
But are you actually going to monitor the usage?
Yeah. One of the things that we are, and this is how I ended up in the conversation with the trustee last week, increasingly when we do surveillances, we're asking people these questions. Can you tell us how many hits you get on this information? What do you think the impediments are to that? Why is it acting? Why are consumers acting in that way? Because, yes, I think there's probably some work to do to make sure that product dashboards are as effective as they could be. And I'm sure many people here will probably say change some of the elements of the dashboard to make it ideal. So.
Yeah. Just also the issue you touched on of defaults and the ASIC guidance to employers about super. Did you actually go to a representative range of employers to ask them why they choose a particular default fund and the basis on which that was done, and also as a consequence of that, what is an appropriate approach by an employer where they can at the moment to select a default fund?
Yeah, very good question. So at the moment, actually, we have very little engagement with employers. It's mostly the ATO that I think that has employer engagement in their area. So what you've seen on our website so far on MoneySmart is really our first foray into that. We haven't really spoken to a lot of employers. We may end up speaking to more as a result of some of the information we've got on the website, but our engagement with them so far has been fairly limited. What we do know, and this is to your point about what they're offered and essentially is some of the things they're being offered, is that all right? Is that, I think, what...
I'm more particularly interested, I mean, I can understand you nominating behaviour that should not occur, but I'm more interested in what should occur. I mean, we've got a lot of default selection at the moment. Whatever happens to the future of the default reward system, let's put that to one side. It's happening at the moment. And I must say, in my experience, I'm familiar with backroom suggestions that do go on from time to time. And it's a pretty fundamental issue because of the high number of members who and always will default.
Absolutely, and we do look at employers and think that they are a critical link in the chain because, and there's different employment arrangements. You might have a corner shop that signs up 2 employees to a particular super fund who are defaulting members. You might also have a very large employer that sets up a corporate plan with somebody, has 20,000 employees and negotiates a particular deal, which is quite a different type of arrangement. So I don't think we have any sort of firm views as to what should or shouldn't happen here, but really our guidance was to say to employers, if it's just that you got offered tickets to a sporting event, that on its own might not be the best reason for selecting a particular super fund over another one. So to focus in on some of those things that we tell all consumers to focus on, fund performance, fees, but also what sort of services they offer, and to think about your own employee demographics. If you have a very young workforce, that might change your perspective on the different superannuation fund that you choose.
Okay, well, I think there's a lot more work to do in that space. Quickly to the audience before we run out of time. Any questions from the audience? Yes. Microphone down here at the front, please.
Hi, Mark Bland, Mills Oakley. Alex, just on that last point, what discussions are happening between ASIC and ACCC on the intersection of third line forcing and 68A? And is there any surveillance activities that may be planned on the potential offerers of these inducements?
It's a really interesting question because when we first started looking at Section 68A, we did assume there'd be a whole lot of third line forcing type issues and that we would be in discussions with ACCC. But when we started looking in more detail, actually there's not a lot of third line forcing. We haven't ended up in those discussions with the ACCC in quite the way that we thought we might. We've had probably more conversations with APRA because APRA obviously has an interest in this area as well in terms of conflicts and a range of other issues that Section 68A breaches might throw up, but not so much the ACCC, and mostly because it's not a forcing issue. Generally, it's not a forcing issue, although there may be instances out there that I'm unaware of at the moment.
Okay, well, regrettably, we're out of time, so I'd ask the audience to thank Stephen and Alex. Thank you very much.